Dear church, let's continue our series entitled The Hall of Flaw by looking at Samson. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. You know, there are certain milestones that a player must reach before being seriously considered for the Baseball Hall of Fame. For instance, it is generally understood that if a player has a career 300 batting average, or if he hits at least 500 home runs, or wins 300 games as a pitcher, that he will at least get on the ballot. I mean, those are achievements that will at least get voters talking about whether he belongs. There are, however, those who have been inducted into the Hall of Fame who achieved great heights in the sport, but their massive success was joined by massive failure. You take Reggie Jackson, for instance. Jackson hit 563 home runs in his illustrious career. However, he also struck out 2,597 times, which is, I believe, the most ever. His career batting average is .262, hardly stellar. But fans love the long ball. I mean, when it comes to sports, we like the players who make a big splash, the ones who hit it a long way, throw it a long way, or run it a long way. And that tends to overshadow any other holes in the person's game. So if they strike out a lot, who cares? So what if they throw it to the other team a lot? So what if they fumble it a lot? We prefer the players who do big things, and as a result, we'll often overlook their failures on the field or on the court. I mean, so what if your favorite player doesn't play a lick of defense? He scores 50 points a night. That's all that really matters. And in the spiritual realm, it's often quite the opposite. The failure or failures often take center stage. Peter would be a prime example of this. So would Rahab, or even the guy we're talking about in this episode. We tend to zero in on the flaw in these Bible characters, which is not all that strange when you consider that we do the same thing in our own lives. We often have a hard time getting past our own failures, but that's the whole reason for this series, to see that the Bible often props the failures up as success stories. Failure doesn't have to be fatal, doesn't have to be final. Hebrews chapter 11 includes some pretty unsavory characters, but the focus is not on their sin, it's on their faith. Look with me at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 and following. It reads, "And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." So Samson gets a mention in the Faith Hall of Fame. He's right there, right alongside such bulwarks of faith as Samuel and Moses and Noah and Abraham. But if you know anything about Samson's character and his story, then you know that he was way more of a rounder than righteous. In fact, when you hear the name Samson, what's the first thing you think of? Probably strength or hair or both, because his strength was connected to his hair. But while Samson was a man of great physical strength, he was also a very weak man spiritually. Judges chapter 16, verse 1 reads, "Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a prostitute there and had relations with her." That tells you something about this Faith Hall of Famer. This is just the beginning of Samson's downward trajectory. He made a series of bad decisions that led to his demise. Gaza was 25 miles from Samson's hometown. Now, assuming that Samson walked it, 25 miles would be about 52,800 steps. Understand that Gaza was the Philistine headquarters and Samson had no business there. He was public enemy number one. So he was putting his life at risk, and the question becomes why? Why would he walk 25 miles and risk his life to see a prostitute? Well, do I really need to answer that? We know why, don't we? We know why because we do it all the time. We don't do what Samson did specifically maybe, but we risk our soul for instant gratification all the time. Sin is attractive. It looks good. It tastes good. It feels good. And that's why we crave it. And ultimately why we engage in it. Samson didn't ruin his life with one bad decision. He took 52,800 steps in a direction towards destruction. And that's how it is for most of us. We don't ruin our lives with just one bad decision. We find ourselves in spiritual chaos, one bad habit at a time, one bad decision at a time, one bad step at a time. Judges chapter 14 and verse 3 also gives us some insight into Samson's character. Notice what it says. It says, "Then his father and his mother said to him, 'Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all your people that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?' But Samson said to his father, 'Get her for me, for she looks good to me.'" It seems that Samson had some pretty shallow criteria when it came to choosing a spouse. Of course, his lust for good-looking women would bring him turmoil later on. Samson's primary folly was his failure to live up to purpose. Judges chapter 13 tells us that the barren wife of Manoah was mysteriously visited by the messenger of Jehovah, who appeared to her in the form of a man. The messenger informed her that she would conceive a son. The child, who would be called Samson, would be raised a Nazirite, and his role would be to begin the process of delivering Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. And because of his special mission, young Samson would be blessed with strength. Now, it's important to note that his growing hair would not be the source of his strength, but rather the sign of his strength. That's an important distinction. The Nazirite vow made him special, and this vow stated that no razor was to touch his head. Samson was set apart for a special mission, which was to rescue Israel, but his strength came from God, not his hair. His hair was the sign, but God was his strength. Of course, Samson would fail many times over to live up to this special calling. For example, he failed to live up to the training he received as a Nazirite as he involved himself in a wine-drinking feast. That was a big no-no. Numbers 6 and 3 tells us that one of the tenets of a Nazirite vow was that he must abstain from wine and strong drink. In fact, the Nazirites were not even to touch the skin of a grape. Samson also took honey from the carcass of a dead lion, another no-no. This violated laws concerning ceremonial separateness. Numbers chapter 6, verse 6 reads, "All the days of his separation to the Lord, he shall not go near to a dead person." But without a doubt, Samson's most notable career lowlight centers around his relationship with a woman by the name of Delilah. Let's go to Judges chapter 16, verses 4 and following. It reads, "After this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, 'Entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver.' So Delilah said to Samson, 'Please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you.' Samson said to her, 'If you bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man.' Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in wait in an inner room, and she said to him, 'The Philistines are upon you, Samson.' But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire. So his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, 'Behold, you have deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound.' He said to her, 'If they bind me tightly with new ropes, which have not been used, then I will become weak and be like any other man.' So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, 'The Philistines are upon you, Samson.' For the men were lying in wait in the inner room. But he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, 'Up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound.' And he said to her, 'If you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man.' So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair and wove them into the web, and she fastened it with the pin and said to him, 'The Philistines are upon you, Samson.' But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin of the loom and the web." So here's the deal. Delilah pulls a Judas and agrees to sell out Samson for silver. But the beginning, at least, Samson decides he's not taking the bait. Delilah may be pretty, but her looks can't get Samson to budge. He's not giving away a secret. But then notice verse 15. It says, "Then she said to him, 'How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told where your great strength is.' It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, 'A razor has never come to my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man.'" So Delilah lays a guilt trip on him, then presses him daily with her words. Translation, she nagged him. She bugged him to death until he finally got worn down. So the Philistines' plan was set in motion, and verses 19 and following read like this. "She made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. She said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Remember when I said that Samson's hair was a sign of his strength and not the source? Well, here's why I said that. He did not know that the Lord had departed him. Did you catch that? Hair was the symbol of his vow, but his strength was found in the Spirit of God being upon him. Verse 23 and following reads, "Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, 'Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands.' When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, 'Our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us.'" The Philistines are celebrating. They're cheering, our God beat your God. Samson's God was no match for our God. The God that was supposedly a God of rescue was soundly defeated. They made fun of Samson and Samson's God by having him come before them and entertain them. The Philistines reveled in their victory as they mocked and ridiculed the man who was supposed to save Israel. But not so fast. Here's the turning point. Although Samson had messed up the plan, God was still working. Notice verses 28 and following. It says, "Then Samson called to the Lord and said, 'O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my two eyes.'" Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he had judged Israel 20 years. Samson recognized where he had gone wrong. Realizing that his strength was in the Lord, he called on God to intervene. In that moment, I believe Samson recognized his set-apartness. In his lowest moment, he agreed with God about his vow and his purpose. In this final prayer, Samson invokes three different names for God. He appeals to Yahweh, the covenant name of the self-existing God. He designates God as Adonai, or Lord, suggestive of the sovereignty or mastery of deity over man. Then he uses the designation Elohim, which is God, and likely points to the strength or power of deity. Now you go over to Judges chapter 15, verses 18 through 20, and we see a glimpse of Samson's faith. It says, "Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, 'You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?' But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi so that water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. Therefore, he named it En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines." Now, let's be honest here. Even in his most faithful moments, Samson comes across as arrogant and selfish. Am I wrong? Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it also seems, based on the information that we are presented, that Samson lived his whole life as a defiant sinner, but somehow snuck into God's good graces at the end. I know his dying moments seem to indicate some remorse and redemption, but that even feels like a reach. At least it does to me. But at the end of the day, who cares? Who cares what I think? Doesn't matter. God felt that this man marred by sin was worthy of induction into the Faith Hall of Fame. Therefore, who am I to judge? You know, the encouragement that we get from these flawed heroes like Samson is that God finds usefulness in what we would otherwise deem as disposable. He finds treasure in the trash. He's not willing to sit you out by the curb. He hasn't thrown you away. If someone like Samson can be used, then certainly you can as well. If one sin didn't define David, then certainly it doesn't have to define you. If a prostitute like Rahab can find favor in the eyes of God, then certainly you can. If Moses can murder yet still see heaven, then there's certainly hope for all of us. But it starts with faith. That's the signature trait of every one of these overcomers that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. Inherent within this signature trait of faith is action. They all did something. They were all moved by faith. Abraham moved, Noah built, Moses led, Gideon fought, Jacob wrestled, Joshua marched. You get the idea? We've all done something in the past. We've all done something we're not proud of. But you're still here, which means that you're still in the game. The final whistle hasn't blown. The buzzer hasn't sounded. The game isn't over. This is halftime. And halftime is a chance to regroup, to rest, and to reset. There's been many, many teams who have found themselves down at halftime, but made some adjustments and came back and won the game. Of course, there have been some teams that were ahead at halftime who lost the game in the end, but sometimes that's because they let up their focus or they didn't adjust. That didn't have to be you. So you've messed up. Maybe you're losing at this point. The game isn't over. This is your halftime speech to get you motivated and to go out there and finish the game. Look, you get to determine the outcome. It's your move. You decide if you win or lose. Don't let a bad half cause you to give up. Get out there and get after it. Play till the whistle blows, and I'll see all of you in heaven. Thank you so much for tuning in. I want to remind you, if you have a question about today's episode or a comment, please feel free to email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.